Hello and welcome to Starving Marvin. In today's video, we're going to be talking about the war in Ukraine. I have to say, just like anyone else, I'm appalled and horrified at what's going on in Ukraine. I hate war. I hate to see young people dying for ideas and ideals that emanate from the minds of old people who are out of touch and seek to restore former glories that have no place in the 21st century. But we should be sensible and objective as we look at this situation. And we should look historically. We should look at why we are in this situation. It all begins in the Cold War with the dissolution of the USSR in 1988. So the Russians and Western powers had been allies against a common enemy, which was Nazi Germany. But after the Second World War, they got entangled in a Cold War, a war of ideology. Basically, the West was capitalist and the Russians were communist. So they had a distrust of each other, but they couldn't have a physical fight because they both had the nuclear weapons and they would be assured of mutual destruction if any one of them would have used the nuclear option. That meant that they had to fight proxy wars and, launch espionage attacks and everything, but they couldn't fight toe to toe because they all had the nuclear weapon. In 1988, the USSR was dissolved and new states were founded, including the state of Ukraine, which was founded in 1991. Just because the USSR was no more didn't mean that the Russians and the West saw eye to eye. There still remains that distrust between the two factions. And the Russians were content with thawing tensions as long as they were guaranteed to have a few buffer states between themselves and the Western powers. And one of those buffer states was Ukraine. Why did the Russians need a buffer state? The Russians needed a buffer state just as a bit of an assurance that America and the Western powers were not on their doorstep. We should note that Ukraine is comprised of different linguistic and ethnic groups. And when we look at electoral results, those differences are strongly evident, with the eastern parts of Ukraine being pro-Russian. Russia has, for a long time, tried to maintain and exert influence on Ukraine. But we should note that Russia is or was content with having Ukraine as a buffer state. They had no ambition or aspiration to take over Ukraine as long as it remained neutral. However, the Europeans managed to seduce the Ukrainians into allying themselves with, the Europeans. And this didn't sit well with the Russians because it meant that they would no longer have their buffer state. As a matter of fact, it seemed as if Ukraine was on the verge of becoming a NATO state that would mean that the powers, the military forces of the Western states would be smack dab in the middle of the Russian borders. And that was totally unacceptable to the Russians. We had a pro-Russian leader in Ukraine, in Viktor Yanukovych. He tried to ally himself with Europe, but he didn't like what Europe was offering. So he chose to ally himself with Russia. And following the failure of the Ukrainian and European deal, Russia offered Ukraine a loan of 15 billion US dollars, just, to maintain Ukraine as a buffer state. But this didn't sit well with the Ukrainian people. They launched what is known as the Orange Revolution. About 60 people died. And in February 2014, Viktor Yanukovych was kicked out. At this point, Ukraine became even more pro-Western. It was on a path to becoming a NATO nation, or so they thought. In the background of all this, Russia was still trying to maintain its borders and trying to keep its borders free of NATO powers. And part of that strategy involved leasing the Crimean area and having a military presence in there just to make sure that Russia was a bit safe. And in 2014, Russia just went ahead and took over Crimea from Ukraine. There was a plebiscite that was held. Maybe people were coerced or whatever to choose Russia. But the fact remains, Crimea became Russian. After that, as I mentioned, Ukraine took a pro-Western stance. And this did not sit well with Putin. And it is understandable, because America wouldn't want Russia to have nuclear weapons or a military presence in Canada or Mexico. As a matter of fact, they have the Monroe Doctrine, which states that no other power can have influence in America's backyard. We can even look, there is a historical precedent. When the Russians had their missiles in Cuba, a sovereign nation just like Ukraine, it wasn't acceptable to the Americans. They had to get those missiles out of Cuba because it was a threat to them. Why then is it acceptable? Why then should Russia accept having American missiles in Ukraine? It's quite unfortunate that we are in the situation that we are in. Ukraine felt emboldened by the West. They thought that the West would stand by them. They took an aggressive stance against Russia. But in the end, what did they get? Javelin missiles, advice, funding. That does not take away from the fact that the Europeans won't put boots on the ground. They won't send troops to help Ukraine. Ukraine will absolutely get obliterated by the Russians. Some NATO states like Germany did not even send any substantial help. They sent helmets, with one European commentator saying, what are they going to send next? Maybe pillows? Ukraine is on its own in this fight. They have the support of the Western powers, but it's all vibes. The Western powers won't send boots on the ground. It's unfortunate that we have this war going on, but we have to understand what led to this war. Basically, we have this war because the Minsk agreement fell apart. We have this war because Russia felt threatened at the loss of a buffer state. It is unfortunate innocent people are dying, but if the Ukrainian leaders had been more thoughtful about this, it could have been averted. This has been Starvin Marvin. Thank you for watching the video. Like, share, and subscribe, and help grow my channel. And do comment. I would like to hear your perspective and your opinions. Thank you.